what I will do is to start with a brief comment about the new government that has been formed today under a new Prime Minister, Groisman. And after that, I'll talk about Yatsenyuk, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who was the Prime Minister from the seizure of power, so the coup in 22 February 2014. And well, his run has ended after 2 years. And then at the end I'll speak about how the EU association agreement combines with the plundering of the Ukrainian economy by the oligarchs into yeah, a complete deindustrialization of Ukraine and its transformation into an agricultural province on the margin of the EU, which is a tragedy because Ukraine used to be the rural area, so the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, the eastern part, the Donbass. And because I always forget my stick with the overhead, I've drawn this map here, just as a background. Because this is Ukraine, as you probably know now. And Ukraine was constituted in this way in 1922, when the first constitution of the Soviet Union was adopted at the end of the year, December 22. And historical Ukraine is composed of the northwest of the country. And most of the people here speak Ukrainian, although they will also use Russian for cultural reasons. And what happened in 1922 was that this area, an area as large as the original Ukraine, was added to Ukraine, and that had to do with the concerns of the Bolshevik party whether they could control this region, which was full of bandits, the famous anarchists of Makhno, and were here, there were Cossacks that the Bolsheviks were not sure they would be able to control. And Lenin and his friends thought that, you know, Kiev is somewhere here, that from Kiev it would be easier to control that area than from Moscow, which is further away. But the important thing is this, this distinction between an Ukrainian-speaking northwest and west, and a Russian-speaking, and originally Russian, ethnic Russian area as large as this one, comes back in everything. So in the last elections that have been held in 2012, the last normal elections, you can see that in this area the Fatherland Party, the Nationalist Party of Timoshenko, had the majority, and in this part the Party of Regions, which is the Federalist Party of Yanukovych. Yanukovych, who at that time was already losing popularity very fast, but even so, people voted for that party. Now here, of course, is the Crimea. That was added to, as you probably know, that was added to Ukraine in 1954 by Khrushchev. People say he was slightly drunk at the time, and he gave the Crimea to Ukraine out of gratitude for its loyal role towards the Soviet Union, which is very doubtful because in the Second World War, of course, Ukraine had a less than honorable record in dealing with the German invaders, and they made their own contribution in a number of war crimes. But that, of course, doesn't go for all the Ukrainians. So that's the background, and many references that I will make will refer to this map. Now, today, first about the government. Today, the government has fallen, definitely, you know, there were already several minor cabinet crises of the Yatsenyuk government, and now it has fallen completely, and it has been taken over by Groisman. And Groisman, Vitaly Groisman, has been selected because he is expected to bring back this part of Ukraine into the running of the country, you know, to give it back political representation, which had been taken away from it by the coup in 2014. Now the Crimea, of course, has meanwhile been reincorporated in the Russian Federation. Now the government has fallen, and the interesting thing, which must be very confusing for people who base their propaganda on the idea that Putin is busy reconquering all the areas that used to be part of the Soviet Union, but the plan for this new government is actually coming from a close friend of Putin, Viktor Medvedchuk, who's an Ukrainian with very close ties to Putin. They are almost family members. And I was always thinking that, well, not always because it happened just today, but I was thinking that it must be very confusing for those who think that Putin is the evil genius in this whole process to see that a measure of re-democratization of the country is actually coming under Russian influence. And the explanation for that is very simple, because Russia is interested in having a functioning economy to its south and not a society which is collapsing. So that's the most recent incident. The government has fallen, and not the American banker Natalie Yaresko has taken over, which was expected for quite a long time, but Groisman, who is a representative of the opposition bloc. And the opposition bloc is the successor party to what used to be the Party of Regions. The Party of Regions was the party of the southeast. The opposition bloc is much weaker because violence has been used, but I'll talk about that in a second. But still it's a political force, and it will grow rapidly because it's always 50-50 in Ukraine. So if, for instance, you read in the paper, I read in the morning paper that 55% of Ukrainians are now in favor of the EU association agreement. These are the people mostly in the northwest. The others are lying low, they are not expressing their opinions, but they will come back very quickly once they have a legitimate voice again in the country's running and government. So, the period of Arseniy Yatsenyuk has ended. He has had basically 2 years, from March 2014 to March 2016, and I think that he's the embodiment of what went wrong, in my view, in Ukraine. So in a way we are looking to some improvement, although it's very important to see that in Ukraine everything is always mortgaged by the role of the oligarchs. And every bloc, every area has its own oligarchs. Yatsenyuk was the man of the United States. You probably all heard about Victoria Nuland, the neocon Assistant Secretary for European and East European and Eurasian Affairs in the State Department under Obama. Before that, she was an assistant to Dick Cheney, so she has been carried over from a hardline Republican government to the Obama government. And Nuland was the person who was constantly flying in and out of Ukraine to convince Yanukovych, then the president, to sign the association agreement. Because the association agreement was the means to tie Ukraine to the West, and to the EU in particular, but then we must realize that the advance of the West has always taken these two tacks. One is the expansion of NATO, and the other is the expansion of the European Union, and they have been more and more narrowly combined into one single process, especially after the Lisbon Treaty of 2008, which introduced for the first time in the European treaty corpus the principle that every state becoming a member of the European Union or associated with it should adopt also the Western defense policy. So the arms procurement, standardization of arms, and ultimately military strategy. And Ukraine has made use of that already, and even though it's not in NATO, because that's a too contentious issue, it is part of several battle groups already with other NATO countries, notably with Poland. Poland really is the engine of this integration going into the Western military lineup. if you're interested, there's a latest magazine which has a special section on Ukraine. You can take that with you if I'm not mistaken. And it speaks in detail about these battle groups. And that's really interesting stuff, because before Ukraine is actually in NATO, it is already integrated into the military lineup. Now back to Yatsenyuk. Yatsenyuk was the man who was selected by Victoria Nuland in her famous telephone call with the American ambassador in Kiev, Jeffrey Pijl, in which he said Yats should be in the government, Klitschko should not be, because he was seen to be too close to Merkel and to the Europeans, and also he was a person who might be too friendly with the Russians, whereas Yatsenyuk was known for his strong anti-Russian views, and he was a neoliberal. And neoliberal means you're in favor of privatization, removal of subsidies, market as a solution for all social problems, and so on and so forth. So Yatsenyuk was selected, although he had hardly a basis to speak of within Ukraine. He was selected by Nuland as the man in the new government. How was it possible that she was in the process of deciding who would be in the new government? Well, because the United States was preparing a seizure of power in the third week of February. I've done some work myself on this. Interesting is that when Yanukovych was confronted with making the choice either between the EU association agreement or the last minute offer by Putin to join the Eurasian Union, he withdrew his signature. You know, in November 2013, he was about to sign, and he withdrew his signature because by then it had been made clear to him that there would be no chance for Ukrainian industry to survive competition with industry from the European Union. And that has to do with the fact that the oligarchs who own this industry actually didn't invest for the entire period of Ukrainian independence. So industries slowly sank to a lower level. Now, 20 February, there were very serious disturbances in Kiev because the police was clamping down very hard on the protests that had been organized against the oligarchs and against Yanukovych in particular, because his son Alexander had become one of the 100 people in Ukraine who together own 80 to 85% of the entire economy, which is probably a world record. And the Yanukovyches, who were, well, I don't think they were poor, but they were not remotely within this class. The son rose to become one of the 100 richest people of Ukraine during his father's incumbency by forcing companies to join forces with his own holding company, etc. So there was spontaneous protest against the oligarchs, and since the most blatant example of stealing from the public coffers was in power at that moment, the protests were against Yanukovych. However, during these protests, fascist and neo-Nazi groups from the west of Ukraine, from the far west, the part that historically has been least connected to the Russian cultural sphere, had come to Kiev armed. They had robbed various arsenals in Lviv, or Lvov, however you call it, in the far west. And with these weapons, so with Kalashnikovs and also heavier machine guns, they were coming to Kiev and were threatening to bring more weapons there. And when that happened, when there was shooting on 20 February, European ministers thought that this was the moment to intervene and to try and quell the violence, for the simple reason that if this would run out of hand, a bloodbath might ensue, and the consequences might be, well, you couldn't foresee the consequences. Also consequences in the sense of Russia intervening in the situation. So three ministers of foreign affairs of Poland, Germany and France came to Kiev to discuss with Yanukovych about peace agreement, well, ceasefire, new elections, changes in the constitution in the way of reducing the power of the president and a few other things. And interestingly, the Americans were not included in those discussions. And that had to do with the fact that the phone call that I just referred to, in which Newland also made the famous remark, fuck the EU, so we have nothing to do with the EU, of course had hit home very hard in the European capitals, and there was no mood at all in the Atlantic. Love affair was at its low ebb, also because at that point exactly the news about the revelations by Edward Snowden about surveillance of European governments by the American NSA were becoming public. So the mood was very bad, and the European ministers thought that it was best that they arrange a ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities. But at the moment that the Europeans were negotiating, and that was at the evening of 22 February, there was a second meeting in Kiev, and that was in the German embassy. And there the main figure was, on the western side, Jeffrey Pijl, the American ambassador. And the person he was negotiating with was Andrei Parubi. And Andrei Parubi is one of the representatives of the far right from the west of Ukraine. Actually one of the founders of what later became the Svoboda party, effectively a fascist party, neo-Nazi party, however you want to call it. And Parubi told the American ambassador, according to a report that came out roughly a year later in the New York Times, he told the American ambassador, either Yanukovych is deposed tomorrow, or we will do it, and to do that we will bring the arms that we now have available from the west of Ukraine. I won't go into all the details, but basically that was the end of the regime of Yanukovych, because the police were withdrawn. They knew that heavy weapons were on their way to Kiev. They also must have known, although that I don't know for sure, but that the Americans had given the green light to Parubi and his fellows to move ahead, although that is not included in the report. And that also led to the flight of Yanukovych. 4 attempts at his life had already been made, and he was helped by the Russians, although Putin had a deep dislike of Yanukovych personally, and also thought that he had handled the situation very badly, but he was helped simply to save his life to get safely to Russia. And after he had left, his place was taken by Yatsenyuk as Prime Minister, because basically he had been anointed by Newland as the man of the moment. Although, as I said, he only represented a very small segment of opinion in Ukraine. And as President, Turchinov, a former head of the Secret Service. And both men, of course, were basically not elected by anyone except the Americans, who had given their blessing to this takeover. And Turchinov announced a law, or parliament, the new parliament from which the communists had been removed and from which the Party of Regions basically had been chased away, only a handful remained. The parliament in session, while armed men were walking through the aisles, so you can imagine how we would be conferring here if guys with Kalashnikovs and balaclavas would be looking at us. But Parliament decided that the law that gave rights to the Russian language were being abolished. And that meant that this red marked part was basically losing its right to express itself in its own language. And that law was adopted by Parliament. And Turchinov, the new president, or the co-president, however you want to call it, was about to sign it, but he was put under pressure by the US Vice President Joe Biden, who is a very important figure in Ukraine and who has constantly intervened in all kind of critical political situation. And Biden called him and said, there's no way that you're going to sign this, because if you do that, there will be fighting. But nevertheless, Turchinov took a week to wait before he made public that he would not sign the law, and in that week a movement of protest began both in the Crimea and in the Donbass, which is the eastern industrial part, where people did basically the same what the people at the Maidan, at the square in Kiev had done, and that is occupy government buildings, unfold banners about everything, and they wanted, they claimed the right to speak their own language. The new regime in Kiev responded to those actions by launching in April the so-called anti-terrorist operation. Of course, that sounds a bit odd because there was no terrorism, but that has to do with the Ukrainian constitution, which decrees that violence against the Ukrainian population can only be perpetrated if we are looking at a situation in which terrorism is a real danger. So it had to be called the anti-terrorist operation. And it began in April after the American politicians, again Biden, but also the head of the CIA, John Brennan, had visited Kiev and probably had given the go-ahead to use this option of applying violence to the east. The Crimea, also in March, held its referendum. It is obvious that the Russians were ready to help for the simple reason that here on the west of the peninsula is their most important naval base at Sevastopol, also a spot from the Second World War where heroic battles were being waged by the Marines, the Soviet Marines against the Nazi invaders. So there are many reasons why the Russian speakers in the Crimea, and the Crimea is mainly inhabited today by Russian speakers and actual Russians, because it's a favorite retirement location as well. So the referendum led to the wish, through the referendum they expressed the wish to return to Russia, and that was gracefully welcomed by Putin for very simple reasons, I think, and that is that very soon after the coup, three former presidents of Ukraine, Kravchuk, Kuchma and Yushchenko, made a joint declaration in which they said that the lease period, because the base, the naval base was being leased to Russia in exchange for cheap gas and so on, that the lease agreement should expire in 2017. So the Russians knew that if this was the new government, that they basically could expect in 2017 the arrival of NATO ships in their historic naval base. And they have no other, because although there is a part of Russia that borders the Black Sea, it doesn't have the facilities to host large ships. Now, Yatsenyuk was the prime minister who launched this campaign against the East, and in May 2015, Poroshenko, of course, the chocolate king as he is called, was elected president. And this election also goes back to an event in March, because there is one important, I won't mention too many names because otherwise we lose track, but there's one very important oligarch in Ukraine. That's Dmytro Firtash. Is one of the key figures in the whole gas business. He was exiled to Vienna because he was being sought by the Americans for fraud, but basically that was a political case, and he was freed on bail, a bail of $125 million, the highest in Austrian history, but in the end the judge of Vienna threw out the case because he said it's politically motivated. But Firtash didn't dare come back to Ukraine. Basically all the oligarchs live outside Ukraine, so Kolomoisky lives in Geneva, Akhmetov lives in London, and in this case Firtash in Vienna. And from Vienna, in March 2014, Firtash ordered Poroshenko and Klitschko to come to him, and he said to Poroshenko basically, you will be president, and Klitschko gets the consolation prize, which is the Lord Mayor position of Kiev. And the reason why he did that was because that was the only way that he could be sure that Poroshenko would be elected, because Poroshenko had been a bit of an opportunist. He had been in both camps. He had been one of the founders of the Party of Regents, but he had also gone over to the nationalist camp during the so-called Orange Revolution in 2004. And so he was a man who could appeal to both sides. Klitschko might be more popular because he was a sports hero and so on. And by making him, or by assigning him the post of mayor of Kiev, basically he was neutralized as a candidate against Poroshenko. The only other candidate was Yulia Tymoshenko, the gas princess, who had been prime minister several times, but she had been locked up by Yanukovych, and she came out of the prison one day after the coup, so angry and so full of revenge that she made very irresponsible statements that scared off large part of the Ukrainian population. So Poroshenko could pose as the moderate candidate, defeating the radical Tymoshenko. Now, Yatsenyuk remained prime minister. After the elections at the end of 2014, he reorganized his party. All these parties are called, for instance, the party of Poroshenko is called the Bloc of Pijl Poroshenko. So it's clear that we're not looking at very profound ideological formations. But interestingly, Yatsenyuk formed a party that is called the People's Front, and one of the founders, co-founders with Yatsenyuk of this new party was again Andrei Parubi. And Andrei Parubi was the guy who negotiated the removal of Yanukovych with the American ambassador. But right after the coup, he also became the secretary of the National Defense and Security Council. And I just found out that I thought it was a sort of act like the American Security Council, but that's not the case. It is actually a council which is superior to both the Defense Ministry and the intelligence services, and well, all military actions. So basically Parubi was in charge of the entire military and intelligence arm of the new regime. He had also been, as I already said, one of the founders of the party, the neo-Nazi party that preceded Svoboda. It was called the Socialist National Labour Party, something inspired by the Nazi party title. And now he became one of the co-founders with Yatsenyuk of the People's Front. And the People's Front just won the election, so they came out the largest party with 22%. Yatsenyuk really made himself the candidate of the ultra-nationalist, sometimes fascist, militias fighting in the east. Because these militias were the only one who really did hand-to-hand and house-to-house fighting, because the normal Ukrainian army suffers from desertion, from people not wanting to shoot at their own country, men and women. So what they are doing is basically shooting from a distance and sending in these battalions. And the battalions are being financed by one of the worst of the oligarchs, Ihor Kolomoisky, who's the owner of Privatbank, the largest bank of the country, but also owns basically the gas business and the oil business, because he owns the only functioning refinery in the country, in Kremenchuk. Now, that ends the story of Yatsenyuk, because since today he's no longer prime minister. That doesn't mean that we will get rid of the battalions that were being financed by Kolomoisky. They may actually, as very often happens when a radical current is no longer able to dominate the whole political scene, they may actually become more violent for a certain period. But in a way, what happened today is positive, because it means that we may be looking at the beginning of a restoration of the political representation of the south and eastern part of Ukraine. Except that the paradox is that here in the Netherlands, of course, we are being told that Putin is the evil genius, and in fact he is behind, through his agent Viktor Medvedchuk, he's behind this rearrangement of the government power in Kiev that has ended the reign of Yatsenyuk. Now, the final point that I want to make is about the nature of the transformation of Ukraine that is being that is the aim of the EU association agreement. The aim of the EU association agreement, and I've just worked through an enormous stack of Dutch government documents that had been asked for or claimed by a group of young Dutch journalists. Follow the Line. If you ever have time, you can check their stuff. It's really quality stuff. And they made a public appeal for the publication of these documents, and they asked me, because they thought, well, there's nothing to do anyway. They asked me to help systematize them, because there's an enormous amount of paperwork, very repetitive. But it's interesting because it shows very clearly that the aim of the association agreement is to turn industrial Ukraine. This is industrial Ukraine, this is agricultural Ukraine, a bit crudely, to turn Ukraine into a deindustrialized agricultural area that serves the European market with sunflower oil, with all kinds of seeds, with nuts, with honey, all kind of products that you don't make much money from, but that is very useful for the EU, because we get cheap oil. On the way here, I saw an advert also from the Party of Animals, which that's not a well, the Dutch people will know what sort of party this is. It's about animal welfare, and they had a picture of the chicken farms in Ukraine, which are chicken farms from the worst type of animal welfare. And one oligarch has chicken farms with a number of chickens equivalent to all the chickens of the Netherlands, and then I'm not counting the government. So we are really looking at an enormous substandard production of eggs and poultry meat that will come into the European market. And as the Party of Animals already said, free trade always has the tendency to lower the standard, because you have no clue any longer where these animal products are coming from, and you have no grip on what is happening there. So basically, the EU association agreement seeks to turn Ukraine into an agricultural supply base for the EU. It has a number of other issues, like it prescribes Ukraine to become member of the Western Defense build-up. And the reason why the EU association agreement corresponds with the power of the oligarchs is because the oligarchs have exactly worked in the same direction, not because they were so keen to turn Ukraine into an agricultural supply base, but because they didn't invest in industry. And let nobody tell you that, of course, in the last month I've done nothing but read and work on Ukraine, and let nobody tell you that this was all a rust belt, of backward industry that no longer functioned, etc. That's not the case at all. The Antonov factories, for instance, are the most modern aircraft factories of the region, and in many respects in the world. For instance, they built the largest transport plane in existence, which can transport inside its hull the Russian space shuttle, whereas the largest American plane has to carry the space shuttle on its back. So we're talking about a miraculous large plane, then you also have Motor Sich, which is a factory that makes, for instance, helicopter engines, and you have a company with an unpronounceable name, Ukrbrom, and a few other things, which makes engines for ships of world-class standard. All these industries now are going downhill. Antonov has been closed. It's incredible if you see what sort of factory that was. It's closed, it's bankrupt. Motor Sich has partly been relocated to Russia and the rest has been closed, and the other engine factory can no longer, ship engine factory can no longer deliver to the Russian market because that's outlawed in Ukraine now. So that is a form of deindustrialization, and that corresponds beautifully with what the EU wants from Ukraine. That is a country without industry, because you can imagine that Airbus will not say to Antonov, well, we like you so much, why don't we move over a little and you make your own planes also for the European market. That's not going to happen. So you see how these two forces come together. Why is that so important? Because the government and the people who are in favor of a yes tell us that the EU association agreement will work against corruption. Now it may work against a sort of corruption that is that when you have to show your passport that you put a €5 note in it, or that sort of corruption. That can be removed by some training, a new ethos in the police. But what the corruption that we're talking about here is the corruption of the oligarchs, which have taken all the national wealth, divided it among themselves, and basically now get the blessing of the EU, because what they have achieved, that is, industry is gone, and effectively it's a raw material country now, agricultural and also other raw materials from the East, and the EU association agreement wants the same. So it's a go-ahead for large-scale corruption, and that is what is happening there. Thank you.